Hello everybody, welcome back to another segment of Ask a Black Belt. This time we have been asked, what advice do I have for a white belt that struggles with perfection? First of all, I believe that perfection is unrealistic and is unattainable. And I think that's something that we should recognize in ourselves and in all walks of life, is that it's impossible to be perfect. No matter if you do your best technique on your best day, there's always something that you could have done better. And I find that to be what is wonderful about Jiu-Jitsu, is that it is a constant search for improvement through the noble quest of perfection. And I think that if you or if someone consistently is searching for perfection, but at the same time aware that it is unattainable, then it can be a wonderful and noble quest to find that perfect performance or perfect technique. So oftentimes those that I believe have a perfectionism quality, they tend to get really frustrated, and it's hard for them to enjoy the process of Jiu-Jitsu because they don't want to do it unless it's perfect. They don't want to do a technique unless they get all the details correct, unless they make the timing absolutely on point, okay? So I'm not sure what this stems from. However, I think it's great to know right away that perfection is impossible. However, it is great to try to achieve perfection as long as you know that you will never get there, as long as you live, okay? Because it could always be better, and especially when we look at it ourselves. Like, I've heard of artists or musicians that have wrote masterpieces of works of art, and then they still look at it as, I could have done this better. They always are looking at the flaws. So even though we might view, this work of art as perfection, it depends on how you look at it or who's looking at it. So perfection is unattainable, and that's a good thing. Another advice for those who struggle with perfection, when they are practicing a technique, each technique has multiple details in it. And when you're learning a new technique, it's impossible to get all the details correct. So when you're practicing a new technique, try to remember as many details as possible, but make what you either talk to your professor or your coach, or create what you think are the most important aspects of the technique. So I would say no more than 3 aspects, 3 details on this technique that you find are the most important. Okay, 1, 2, 3 in the rank of order. And then start with 1, and when you're doing the technique, don't worry about any other detail except that one important detail. And then you can start to try to perfect that important detail, right? And then as you start to become a little more satisfied with that detail, then you can maybe go to the detail number 2, which you ranked as importance in your in performing the technique, right? And then you can go down the list 1, 2, and 3, and I would stick with that. And don't get overcomplicated, and because there's so many details in a technique, well over, I can't even count how many details are in one technique that are important. They all are important. However, if you spend time and talk to your professor, I bet there's 1 or 2 that some might argue are the most important, and just focus on that. Because I think people that are focused on perfection, they get overwhelmed with everything, and then they don't want to even go from step 1 to step 2 until they get step 1 right. And I can see the frustration as a student and also as a professor, because I want people to enjoy themselves and I want people to feel Jiu-Jitsu, right? Jiu-Jitsu is not so much a thinking sport, although people call it a thinking, like human chess, but I believe Jiu-Jitsu is much more of a feeling martial arts, a much more of a feeling sport than a thinking sport. I would say 3 to 1 in importance. Feeling is the most important thing. So when you get stuck on step 1 of the technique and you won't even go to step 2 because you have to get it perfect, you're stuck here. Go through the technique without thinking too much. Just feel it. It's okay if you make a mistake. And then when you get to that most number 1 important detail, then you do all the thinking in the world, focus on that detail, get it correct, and then go again. You have to get all these repetitions in order for you to feel what the technique is like, and in order for your body to self-correct itself, or for your professor or coach to give you some feedback. And there's nothing wrong with doing extra repetitions on your own. I think that if you struggle with perfection, then you'll never do enough repetitions of a technique, because you're always going to want to do it better. You're always going to want to do it better. This could be a great trait. So all these different personality traits have an asset and a defect, right? So what could be your biggest defect could also be your biggest asset if you're able to reframe your thinking. So get extra repetitions on the techniques that you want to perfect. So maybe during the open mat time, get on the mat and find a willing participant, a willing partner, and take turns drilling techniques for an X amount of time. Because normally during the class, you go through 3, 4 techniques and you really don't have time to perfect any of those techniques, but you just have a little bit of time to feel them and to try to develop some concepts about them. And then you're gonna have to do extra work in order for you to improve. My professor always told me, and I agree with this 100%, and I feel that many students get frustrated with this, is that we can only teach you 20% of Jiu-Jitsu. The other 80% you have to learn on your own. I'm gonna say this again. Your professor or coach can only teach you 20% of Jiu-Jitsu. The other 80% you have to learn on your own. And for me, that goes back to the feeling part of Jiu-Jitsu. I can give you some ideas and some insight as to my conception or my perception of Jiu-Jitsu and what has worked for me over my years of training. And you can take that and then you have to adapt it to what works for you, right? I am a different person. You are a different person. You're gonna take this technique and maybe only part of it works for you, or maybe you have to modify it, or maybe none of it works for you, but through practice of this technique, you're able to develop an understanding of an important concept that you can apply to other techniques. So that is the self-discipline aspect of Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu is a great tool for us to become self-disciplined, and that's where the other 80% comes in, is you must reflect and drill and reflect and drill and make mistakes and strive for perfection, knowing that it will never be achieved. The last aspect of, or last piece of advice that I can give to the white belts that are struggling for perfection is during the sparring portion of the class. So one, we already discussed that perfection is unrealistic, and although it's a noble quest, you'll never reach perfection, and that could be a good thing. And two, we've talked about when practicing new techniques, then we can break down that technique and focus on only 1 or 2 important details and try to do our best to perfect just those small details instead of the whole technique. And then little by little, we can improve our technique by compartmentalizing the technique in itself. And then you can get extra practice on open mat times, or before, after class, or at home if you have your own mat, or a willing friend or a family member that will help you. And the last piece of advice is during sparring, you have to have a different focus on what you want to perfect. You have to have a goal in mind while sparring, okay? When you spar as a white belt, there's a good chance you're gonna be focusing a lot on defense and a lot on survival. So I would not be thinking about perfecting a loop choke in your first year in Jiu-Jitsu, or perfecting a omoplata, okay? What I would think about is, if you want to perfect something during sparring, it's gonna have to be on the defensive end. And I wouldn't necessarily make it too specific. Like, for example, I wouldn't say, I want to perfect the escape from knee on belly, or I want to perfect the armbar escape, okay? What I recommend is something that's more broad, but very important. Like, I want to perfect my frames, because you will start to use your frames all the time, every day. Every sparring match that you do in the dojo, you are gonna have to use your frames, because you will be focusing a lot on survival and defense. And frames are a huge part about that. Another technique that will help is shrimps, your elbow escapes, your ebi, your snake moves, whatever your gym calls it. Frames and shrimp go together all the time, and bridge. So I would say those are the three things you want to focus on if you're looking for something to perfect as a white belt during your sparring session. Bridge, frame, and shrimps, okay? See how those techniques always are somewhere in your defense. Every technique when you are on the bottom, and this is a Jiu-Jitsu hack that I have realized not that long ago, maybe a couple years ago, is that every technique on the bottom requires frames, bridging, and shrimping. Sometimes maybe you can get away with without one of them, but it almost always requires 2 or 3 of those 3. Bridge, frame, and shrimp. And not always in that order, but that's Jiu-Jitsu on the bottom in a nutshell. If you perfect those 3, you'll be a black belt, 100%. If you can perfect bridge, shrimp, and frames. Okay, so I hope this really helps all those white belts who struggle with perfection. I'm gonna give a quick recap on the 3 pieces of advice that a white belt who is a perfectionist can focus on, that will help them improve in their Jiu-Jitsu journey, okay? 1, remind yourself that that perfection is unattainable, and that is a good thing. When you do new techniques, try to compartmentalize the important details of the technique. That way you're only trying to be perfect in 1 or 2 aspects of the technique, not the whole technique, and that'll give you more time to drill and focus on the important parts and get a good feeling of the overall technique. And during the open mat, or before or after the class, or at home on your own time, drill as much as you can to improve your techniques. And last but not least, is during the sparring portion, focus on frames, bridge, and shrimp. And I think these goals will help you to manage your perfectionism while training Jiu-Jitsu. I hope this helped you.